We're about 30 people still coming in.
Okay, we'll wait. Hello, everybody. We're just waiting for people to enter. This is Julia Landau from Mass Advocates for Children. David will give me the green light.
The numbers are still climbing, so definitely a good sign.
Thank you for your patience. I guess we should try to start a little bit before 8 next time.
I think you're good to go.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Good evening on August 20th. We were just talking about how it's hard to believe it's the end of August and getting dark. And here we are still in the midst of the pandemic and COVID and trying to figure out how to make sure that the needs of children with disabilities can be adequately met during these just unprecedented times. I'm joined tonight by Liza Hirsch. She'll be co-presenting with me, and she has a young baby who is not cooperating with going to sleep, so she's going to hop in when she can, and I'm gonna start, and she'll join us. Also, Joanne Pino is here facilitating. David Spicer is our communications intern, and he's going to be reading your questions as we go through. And Janine Solomon, one of the other attorneys here, will also be facilitating those who are participating live from Facebook, and welcome to all of you as well. As you know, we're going to be talking about compensatory services at last. We had to postpone 2 weeks ago because the state just issued their guidance earlier this week. And it's complicated because we're talking about compensatory services, and there's a poll right now, just we want to know what kind of disability your child has. But we're talking about compensatory services at a time when parents, all of you, are facing so much uncertainty about if and when and how your schools are going to reopen. And things are changing. You know, we know so many school districts may have informed parents of one plan, they're going in person, and now they're going remote or they're going hybrid. So as we talk to families and ask them how they're doing with this uncertainty, they talk about their worries, their fears, their anxiety, their exhaustion. It seems pretty consistent what we're hearing across the board. It's what we hear from educators and teachers as well. These are very, very trying times. So the provision of compensatory services because of the pandemic, it's a complex topic. The policy guidance from the State Department of Ed is 18 pages, I think, single space. It's fairly dense because it is so complicated. And Liza and I are going to give an overview of some of the main points and the process and the steps that families can take going forward. Recognizing at the same time, you're very worried and having to advocate about how to make sure your child's IEP is fully implemented, however schools do open. So just briefly, a few housekeeping things. We'll end at 8:45 for those who can't stay for a full hour, but we will stay on until 9 to continue answering questions. This is being recorded, and David has a few other logistics to go over for folks.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining us tonight. So we'll be pausing throughout tonight's presentation to take your questions. Please submit any questions you have using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you joining us on Facebook, hello. Please submit your question as a comment under the live stream. And then if you see someone else's question that you'd like us to answer, please give it a like. All right, thank you, Julia.
Thank you. And we are, as we do every chat, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. We won't be able to get to everybody's questions, unfortunately. David is going to share with you in the Q&A the link so that you can either call our helpline or you can go online to email your question, and somebody from the helpline will get back to you to help answer your questions. And please, share not just your questions, but any suggestions or strategies you all have, because you have a lot of experience and expertise yourselves that can be really helpful for the other families. So I have to forward my own slides. So what we hope you walk away with tonight is a clearer understanding of what COVID-19 compensatory services are, and who is involved in determining whether your child needs compensatory services and what type of compensatory services. We hope it's very clear the importance of your observations and as parents and your input, since you've been in the front lines observing everything all these months. And then we're going to go through the different steps for IEP teams to determine the need for compensatory services. So first, in terms of what are compensatory services, this COVID-19 compensatory services the reason they're being called COVID-19 compensatory services is compensatory services are a remedy that can generally be available if your child's IEP hasn't been fully implemented in certain circumstances. But the state is calling these COVID-19 compensatory services because they've set up some parameters and some guidance and some procedures given the unprecedented nature and the magnitude of the number of children impacted. So the guidance and the process here is specific to COVID. It's not necessarily something that you could use whenever we are facing non-pandemic times, which we hope is sooner than later. So these are services that will address, and we're going to go into this in more detail, any loss of skills or knowledge that your child may have experienced because of this unexpected interruption of services due to the pandemic, or your child's lack of progress. If the loss of skills or lack of progress is linked to IEP services either that weren't provided or IEP services that a district provided remotely, but as we've heard from families through all these chats, there are some students who have not been able, because of their disabilities, to access the remote IEP services. So both circumstances, potentially a child is eligible for compensatory services. We know that all children with disabilities, without disabilities, have experienced some lack of progress because of schools being closed. And so what we're going to go through is the process specific for students with disabilities to determine whether or not additional special ed compensatory services are required to address the gaps in learning. In terms of what COVID-19 compensatory services are, these are in addition to the IEP services that are already on your child's IEP. It's not whatever IEP services are on your child's IEP, the state has made very clear they're supposed to be fully provided and implemented no matter what way that your district is opening in the fall, whether it's a hybrid model, whether it's full-time remote, the services in your child's IEP are supposed to be fully provided. So compensatory services are in addition to those services. They're not going to be included in the IEP because they are in addition to the IEP services. And these are services that are going to be based on the information provided by the school and others, but absolutely by the parents. This guidance makes very clear throughout that the parent input is critical. And the services through the process with you involved have to be specific about if they're needed, what type, what amount, and what duration. So compensatory services, it depends what wasn't provided in your child's IEP. It could be additional speech therapy or ABA therapy that might be necessary. It could be additional instruction provided after school or during school breaks. There's a range of services that might be necessary for your child to address the gaps in learning that have occurred due to the pandemic. So the who, that's kind of generally what the what, and I'm sure we'll have questions, but who determines? What the state has said is that it'll be the IEP team with the parent determining the need for COVID-19 compensatory services. And there's three ways that this could occur, and the parents have to agree if it's going to be anything other than a full IEP meeting. It could be a full IEP meeting that it can be convened in person or more likely right now remotely. It could be an IEP meeting without certain team members if you as a parent agree that it doesn't need to be every team member that participates in the meeting, and if there are members who have relevant information, they provide it in writing to the members of the team. And it's also okay if the parent, if you choose to agree to have a more informal process, which may be a more expeditious and swift way to come to agreement that some parents may want to try, as long as you understand what the process and the parameters are. So whatever way this decision is made, you'll still want to consider the same questions that need to be answered to determine whether your child needs services, and if so, what the scope of services are. But it's to underscore that if it's the parent's choice, there may be a reason that it's appropriate, you feel, to go with a more informal process, because obviously school districts are going to be having to convene thousands and hundreds of IEP meetings, and they're ultimately going to have to inform, whatever you decide will have to be confirmed in writing as well. Let's do a few more questions maybe, and then I'll make 2 more slides and then go into questions. So just to emphasize, is that good, David? Are there questions coming in yet, or?
You can do a few more slides and then we'll go
Okay,
over.
great. So what the state has said about your input as parents to the determination about the need for compensatory services is that districts need to prioritize getting information, observations from families directly, and that the information that they will need you as a family member to inform the IEP team about is, was your child able to access remote learning? Did your child face any issues with attention or engagement to the remote learning that was offered last spring? Were there any behavioral issues? What did you observe in terms of progress and skills? Did your child gain skills? Did they lose skills? And what was the impact of COVID-19 generally on your family that may be impacting your child's ability to learn and learn successfully? Districts can offer you a tracking sheet, the state has said, and so we're asking this polling question about how many of you did your school district give you some kind of tracking sheet or other information so that you can keep track of how your child has been doing over these last months. But even if this district does, you can use that. We would encourage you to use it if it's a useful tool, or you can collect the information and your observations on your own. But we do strongly encourage you, hopefully you've been having some ability to do that over these months, and even now, starting on August forward, it'll be important to start pulling this information together if you believe it's important to pursue additional compensatory services for your child. I think, what the state really acknowledges in their guidance is what you all have experienced, is that you all as family members are on the front line. You're the ones who spent hours of every school day for the weeks and months directly observing your child. And that's why the emphasis on your input is so critical to making these decisions. The other thing that the state has said is that as school districts get clear about how they're going to reopen, and then they think about how to convene these team meetings to address compensatory services, is that they prioritize high-need students, and they have said that these are the students who are likely going to need compensatory services. That doesn't mean that that if your child falls into these categories, they automatically get compensatory services. But the state guidance makes it clear that many of the students in these categories are very likely going to need some level of compensatory services. And the deadline for convening IEP meetings, or if you as a parent decide to go through a more informal process, is December 15th. And the students that are prioritized are students with complex and significant needs, and we'll be going over how the state has defined those students on the next slide. It also includes preschoolers who experience delays when they turned 3, because of if they turned 3 and they weren't able to get their evaluation completed, and so they couldn't start services by age 3. Then those students should be prioritized. Also, students who turn 22 between March 15th and December 23rd, and other students who didn't receive or weren't able to access IEP services. They've also made it clear that this prioritization shouldn't in any way delay the implementation of your students' current IEPs when the school year starts. Again, we're balancing implementation of your child's IEP now and trying to make your child whole with compensatory services. The other thing that the state said in terms of this notion of if your child missed services, what services can help to make them whole, to make up for the skills that they weren't able to gain. And the state has said it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. You know, if your child missed 30 speech therapy sessions, it might be that the team decides they need 30 additional speech therapy sessions, but it may not be an automatic one-to-one correspondence. That's something that the team will have to decide. So in terms of how the state's defining students with complex and significant needs, you'll see it's the same definition as those students who are supposed to be prioritized for in-person learning this fall. So these are the students who should be prioritized for determining whether or not they need compensatory services. And so they're the students who are identified as high needs on your child's IEP administrative form. And David's going to share with you that form. It's called the PL3 Primary Disability Level of Need, but it's a form that is filled out for every child that designates the amount of services that the child receives, you know, during the day and where those services are provided. So that's one way to identify the child as complex and significant needs. It also includes students who couldn't engage in remote learning because of the significant disability that they have, students who use augmentative alternative communication, students with disabilities who are homeless or in foster care, and students with disabilities who are English learners.
Would now be a good time for some questions?
Absolutely.
Perfect. And thank you for everyone who submitted your questions. And again, you can submit those through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So our first question is, what if the district is only providing remote even when the child wasn't able to access remote services in the past? Is the school required to do it in school or provide services in the home?
Is the question do you know if it's about how compensatory services should be provided or how the services should be provided when school reopens?
I think more the latter.
I guess I could try to answer both. So I'm sorry. So if you have a child who received remote instruction last school year and possibly over the summer, and your child has complex and significant needs, and the school district is offering, at least at the beginning of the fall, only remote learning, then the state is provided for all students. The state has made it clear that students in this category should still be provided in-person learning opportunities in a way that is safe and meets the health and safety requirements of the school district. So even if students are in the red zone, or for those of you who are familiar with these different designations, if that's the district that you live in, districts are supposed to be trying to figure out a way to provide safe in-person services for this population of students with complex and significant needs. Now, another question, and I don't know which question this person was asking, is if a child was provided remote special ed services, can the compensatory services be remote? And again, that's going to be an IEP team determination. The compensatory services have to be effective to help address a child's loss of skills or lack of progress. So if the team determines remote teletherapy could be effective, then it could be remote therapy. But if the team determines that remote instruction won't be adequate to address the gaps in learning, then remote compensatory services wouldn't be appropriate. I hope that made sense. People can ask more questions if it needs more clarification.
Another question seems to be pretty popular. So if a parent has been paying out of pocket for external therapists during quarantine and uh, the child hasn't really shown much significant losses, has maybe even made some progress in the areas, is it still possible to make the case that the child did not receive adequate services during the spring and ESY as outlined in the IEP? And then a follow-up, would they be eligible for compensatory services?
Let me see if I've got the question right, David. Help me here. So if a child was basically making adequate progress because the parent was paying out of pocket for additional
Correct.
services, would they arguably have a right to compensatory services in that situation? And again, I think it's a cogent argument. Your child may or may not qualify for a priority IEP meeting. But if they're, we're going to go through the steps. And so the answer to the question may be clear when we go through the steps of how the IEP team is going to make this determination. But I think it's a really good question, because if the only reason the child is making adequate progress is because the parent was able to pay for some services out of pocket, I think it's, potentially a claim. But I think it would be a good thing to call our helpline about and let us have some more time to think about. I think it's a good question. And I'm not sure, for that more thinking.
Right.
It is possible, if what you're looking for is additional services or reimbursement for services, and it's probably really important to give some written notification to the school districts. If the school district has not been able to implement the IEP, and you had to seek something privately that you want to try to seek reimbursement for, then it's important in terms of how the law works to provide them some written notice before you make the claim that that's what you had to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, I think you addressed it. A third question we have is, if IEP services provide a shared aid in an inclusion classroom, how would they offer this type of support in a remote setting?
That's a great question. I know that the state has been thinking about this issue, and the question could have relevance both to compensatory services as well as how services will be provided going forward in the fall, right? So if you have an IEP that calls for a shared aid and that paraprofessional was not available to support your child in remote learning, then that's going to be an IEP service that wasn't provided. And so that might be a factor in determining whether or not your child needs compensatory services. I think since the state has been so clear that IEPs have to be fully implemented, then again, it's hard to know without looking at the actual IEP of the student that this parent's asking about. But going forward, the district should figure out how to have a paraprofessional available for your child and whatever other child is sharing the aid, whether that's going to practically mean you need more than one paraprofessional or you both need to know the different times when the paraprofessional will be available. It really would depend on your child's needs and how the IEP is written. But the bottom line is, if a para is required in the IEP, then it needs to be provided if your child's getting remote instruction.
Right. And then probably one more question before moving on. So I know you mentioned that December 15th deadline. This parent has a question. Can districts go ahead and refuse right now the compensatory services, or is that something that the timeline seems to be off?
That's a great question. A district cannot refuse compensatory services without first convening the team and having the kind of discussion we're going to go through in more detail going forward. They cannot decide unilaterally without convening you and the other team members to figure out whether your child has complex and significant needs or more mild and moderate needs. They have to convene the team unless you agree to a more informal process. The December 15th is the latest deadline. The expectation, I think, of the state is that districts start, obviously they're dealing with a lot of reopening issues right now, but these services for some kids are so critical, they really want districts to start convening these meetings as soon as possible. So I hope that answers the question. Again, it's hard without knowing exactly if I'm getting the question right.
Yeah, I think that was good. Would you like one more, or?
Why don't we go on, because we may answer some of the questions, and then
Sounds good.
Liza's baby is not wanting to go to sleep tonight. So as the team process or the more informal process gets convened, the state has said that the educators, the administrators, the parents together have to review information from all sources, from families, from educators, from outside providers. That could be physicians, that could be folks from DDS, that could be daycare folks, that could be people providing mass rehab if your child was getting some kind of remote transition services. And so the information that's going to make the determination is your observations about progress, your child's IEP progress reports, the more informal assessments that your teachers might be providing remotely, and information about if your child has had difficulty regaining lost skills in the past, in the summer, so that they've required extended school year or summer services. That's another indication that they're likely going to need compensatory services, because the team already determined that for a shorter summer break, they need services over the summer. And any other information or observations that you or others who work with your child and know your child have. So step one, the IEP team meets, or you're meeting more informally if that's what you prefer. And the first question, that we kind of reviewed this quickly at the beginning, but you'll want to be prepared to be as specific as you can about, were there any IEP services that were not offered? And you should look at your child's IEP. You may know off the bat that your school district never provided speech therapy. There was no speech teletherapy. So some of those things may be very clear. There may be other instructional and other services that they provided part of the time and not all of the time. So our advice to you is to, as you prepare for this meeting, to be really clear about, as clear as you can about what IEP services were offered, but also, were there any barriers that were preventing access to your child's IEP services because of their type of disability, because of the lack of a device or internet that was working, or the tech support that was needed, or because things weren't provided in the home language, or other things that may have made it so that even though the district was offering services, they weren't accessible to your child. And you know, we know that we've heard from so many families, and we've heard this over our last chats, there's so many families who there were services offered on the screen like I'm looking at right now. And because of the child's autism, or because of the child's other disabilities, their child could not sit down, they could not attend, they could not get any meaningful learning from what was being offered. And if that's the case, your observations and your information about how that worked. And again, we've encouraged you to, we have an app that might help you to keep track of things. You can take videos, short videos on your phone to show the team what the reality was as your child is trying to learn remotely. And especially since there may be more remote instruction in the fall, you may have more opportunities to show some of these things. Step two, if there were services that were not provided or that were not accessible, then the team with you front and center is going to address, were there skills or knowledge that your child lost, skills that they had in March when the schools closed, and then they've lost some of those skills, regression, or has your child failed to make progress that was expected? And so we're asking you here in a polling question what you've observed about your child's progress since schools were closed, because this is the kind of information that you're going to want to share with the team. And to the extent that you have information from not just yourself, but from others who are working with your child to support that, that will be really helpful for the team. So what the state has said is, in terms of losing skills or failing to make progress, You would start by looking at what were your child's present levels of performance on March 17th, when schools close. Basically, where was your child, whether it's math or reading or communication or behavior? What were their skills March 15th? What are their skills at the time now or when your team is meeting? And what is the progress you would have expected over these months? And that's part of how you're going to gauge whether or not your child's made the kind of progress that was anticipated based on the IEP, the way it's written. And again, think broadly, your own observations, other family members, caregivers, physicians, ABA providers, if you have private ABA, insurance ABA. There's a lot of information that could be very helpful for the team in making this determination. Now it's stuck. Step 3, what do I do, David? It won't move.
You have to make sure you're on your slide, Julia. Put your cursor on the slide and tap it.
Oh, there we go.
Now you went 2. Are you going the wrong way?
What 2? It's going backwards. It won't go. It's going forwards. How do I go back now? Let's see. There we go. Sorry, people. Step 3. Thank you for being patient with me. So if your child didn't receive, it wasn't offered, or wasn't able to access IEP services, if they've lost skills or didn't make the expected progress, then the team with you there should determine, do they need COVID-19 compensatory services? And if yes, then determine what type of instruction or therapies, what amount, when and where those services should be provided. And after that decision is made, then the district has to give you written notification in what is called an N1 form or some other form about what the team agreed to. And so again, if you're, this is also where if you have a physician or you have other people who are working with your child, they might also be able to help inform you about what kind of an amount and type of compensatory services are going to help to make your child make up for the services and all the lost instruction that they may have experienced in these unbelievably unprecedented times. There's another step that the team could make. One is, does your child need compensatory services to make up for the services that they didn't receive that were in their IEPs? Unfortunately, some kids are going to need additional IEP services going forward because they're going to have new areas of need because of what they've experienced through the pandemic. This could include mental health needs, social emotional needs, other kinds of learning needs. So the team may decide that in addition to or instead of, it can be either, it can be both, or it could be one or the other. Your child's needs some behavioral support or some counseling or some types of services and accommodations to address their anxiety. And those services to address their new needs would be written into the service delivery grid. The team might have enough information to know what new IEP services are required, or they may suggest another evaluation or a reevaluation and ask for your consent for that. And then we run into the problem of how backlogged school districts are with conducting evaluations because everything came to a screeching halt in the spring. But it is important to know that your child might need compensatory services, and they also might need, or instead of, they might need some additional IEP services because of new needs. We know that kids have experienced a lot and they may have new needs related to their disability. There's a third thing that the IEP team can discuss, which is the general, what's called general education recovery support. So as we talked about in the beginning, all kids in gen ed, kids without disabilities, experience these gaps in and disrupted learning because of the pandemic. And so all school districts are going to be providing general ed recovery support to help address the gaps in learning that's been experienced by all kids. And these services that are gen ed services will address academics. They'll also address social and emotional needs. The IEP team does not have to be involved in deciding whether your child can access these gen ed supports. Your child is able to get these supports like every other child is. If your child needs some of these services and accommodations and supports need to be provided, then that could be something that the team might consider. But it's not an IEP decision. However, the state has said that if your child, they can consider if the recovery services that they're providing might in part be able to help meet your child's needs from the lack of implementation of their IEPs. So there is going to be a relationship, even though these are not part of the IEP decision. And then lastly, for students turning 22 between March 17th and the end of December, these are also, as we said, priority students where the IEP team should meet sooner than later, at the latest by December. Because as you know, these students normally would have exited special education and moved on to their adult services if they have an adult service agency, and everything was disrupted and fairly chaotic. So the state has encouraged through this guidance that school districts convene IEP meetings to prioritize these students, and then have the IEP meeting meet to determine same things we talked about with kids of all ages. Was a student unable to access services and their loss of skills or failure to make progress? But also to answer questions such as, if this is a student who, because of their disability, has difficulty with change and difficulty with transitions, did the closure because of the pandemic make the move to adult services more challenging, which might relate to their need for compensatory services? Or was there an ability to connect effectively to the adult agencies? Because the adult human service agencies, also, came to a halt and were, at least had services disrupted as they got their bearings of how to do things during the pandemic. And they may not have been able to follow through. Or you may have a child who was expected to pass MCAS and graduate, but was unable to due to the school closure. So those are some of the examples of what the state has directed school districts in their guidance to consider. And then in the same way that we talked about for all kids, if the team determines that your child who turned 22 needs compensatory services, then the team should look at the full range of services that are in the IEP. That includes, the services that address all the transition services, and the guidance gets very specific. The teams can consider travel training, they can consider job coaching, they consider community-based instruction, independent living skills instruction. Those are all the kinds of compensatory services that can be considered for this age range, in addition to any other, ABA and speech therapy and other services that may be relevant in terms of this determination.
Do you have time for some questions?
Sure.
Perfect. So we have the situation where a parent was told that any services delivered remotely requires the parent to deliver it. So for example, during this past ESY, the parent had to facilitate the online OT and speech sessions. No ABA or PT was delivered since it was done remotely. So the question is, if a district won't allow staff to provide OT, PT, speech, ABA in person, may the parent hire someone on the district's tab since private providers are open?
Again, I think if they're talking about going forward for the coming year, I think that's something that a lot of families may want to consider. If their child is a high need child, with complex and significant needs, and should be receiving in-person instruction, if I'm understanding the question correctly, when schools open in the fall and the district isn't offering ABA or other services in person, then I would call our helpline, because depending specifically on how things are written in the IEP, it may be reasonable if things are documented in a certain way, in the way we're talking about, there's very specific notice provisions. If a district is failing to implement an IEP and the parent wants to get reimbursement for services, there's some very specific notice provisions that parents should go through first. Our suggestion would be to first do what we're going to talk about shortly, to reach out to the district to advocate for the in-person services being provided by the school district, but it's absolutely fair game if the school district can't do that. Since the school district has to implement your child's IEP, and if it's impossible to implement it remotely, then I think there's a legal argument for the fact that the family, for those who have the resources to do it, may need to seek reimbursement if they're able to do it on their own.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So our next question, it seems a couple parents are in this spot. So the district is offering hybrid half-day alternating days model. Special education students will get the opportunity for every day in person, half a day. However, DESE guidance states full day, every day when feasible. So the specific question is, if there will be no other students in the building every afternoon, why can't the district offer full day every day? And does the district have a legal obligation?
The district has a legal obligation to implement every child's IEP fully. And they have to provide in-person instruction in a manner that's safe and meets health requirements. So again, without knowing the specifics of why the district made that decision and why they believe that only half a day is what is they can do safely and consistent with all the requirements of the state, I don't know the answer, again, without knowing the particulars of the situation. But if a child has special ed services in their IEP requiring full day instruction and they're providing in-person half a day, then the school needs to be implementing the other half remotely, and remotely in a way that's effective, which we know is a lot easier said than done.
Right, right.
But again, that's the perfect situation where it would be good to call the helpline, because the devil is always in the details.
For sure. So in regard to transition age kids, which I believe we covered just the previous slide, how will they be placed by DDS due to no progress? And how will they gain access to IEP services, especially vocational ones?
Let me answer this question, and then I want to be able to finish the rest of the slides by 8:45 and then do more questions.
Sounds good.
I'm not sure I exactly understand about the question is around DDS, but DDS is, all the agencies are trying to get up to speed. So there should be more ability to, but I don't know what the barriers are for that family in transitioning to whatever services should be available for their 22-year-old through DDS. But regardless of when and how that transition happens, an adult who turned 22 who's entitled to COVID compensatory services can, after they're 22, still get those services from the school district. And then in your team meeting, you would decide what those services are and where those services should be provided. Should they be provided on the school site? Should they be provided, if the DDS services are beginning on the site that DDS is providing? Should they be provided at home? Again, these all have to be individual determinations made in collaboration, and they very much encourage the adult human service agencies to be participating in these team meetings so that the teams together can figure out where and how to provide these services.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
So let me go on quickly through these slides for those who need to go, and we can stay on more to ask more questions. Very briefly, just so we know, and I can answer the details more in questions if people have them. The state has said very clearly for students of any age who, let's say their initial evaluation to enter special ed was delayed. It was supposed to be done in April, and it ends up being done, many months later. When the IEP team meets to determine eligibility, if they determine eligibility, then at that time they should also figure out whether the child needs compensatory services to address the lack of learning during those months of delay. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to be very quick, but ask questions if it doesn't. There's also very clear guidance about families who moved between March 17th and now. let's say a family moved in August, and the question is, how are compensatory services to be provided? And so what the state has suggested is that wherever the child moved, that new district could convene the team to figure out whether or not compensatory services are needed. And they suggest that the district where the child lived previously should pay for those services. And the last question issue is for students who are in out-of-district placements, whether they're collaboratives or private day schools, how does the compensatory decision get made? So it's the same process we described. The state has strongly encouraged that the school district and somebody from the out-of-district placement be at the team meeting, go through the same process for determining the need for compensatory services. And in terms of who provides them, it's going to have to be, you know, a determination based on the agreement and the contracts between the school district and the out-of-district placement. But the state has said in most cases, it'll probably be the out-of-district placement that would provide the services. But again, it's not a rule across the board. So very briefly, in terms of what can you do now? And it just seems overwhelming because you're all struggling with how to get your child services in the fall, which is probably first and foremost what's most important. And here's another polling question about, you know, what you think your child would need between all the kinds of things that you've heard the state has said the school district should be offering. And at the same time, you obviously want to make up for what your child has lost in these past months. So what you can do now around compensatory services is, if you believe that this is an important issue for your child, even though these meetings will not happen for the most case until the schools open, we would suggest you email your team leader or your principal now to tell them why you believe your child fits into, if you believe they do, the children who should be prioritized for IEP meetings. I would, you know, be very clear in whatever you communicate to the school district about why it's so important and urgent. If they couldn't access the services or if things weren't provided, begin to gather the information that we were talking about IEP services that were not offered or not accessible. You could start to gather information from others who know your family, other family members and outside agencies and professionals. And last, here in orange, keep documenting how your child is doing. And if you haven't been documenting, start documenting now. You're going to have more weeks, sadly, until schools open. And you can use this app that's here that can go onto your phone or any other system you want. So you know your child, you know how they're doing, you know if they've lost skills or if they haven't been able to learn skills. And the more you can show that, the more you're going to be able to work collaboratively with the school district to figure out what additional services your child needs going forward. If you have these meetings and you don't agree with the school about the amount of services or the determination about whether your child needs compensatory services, you have the option, if you can't come to a consensus informally, you can file a complaint with the state. We've got the information here to do that. You can ask for mediation or a hearing. We strongly encourage you to call Max Helpline. Our hope and the state's hope is that by working collaboratively and really listening to families who know what your kids have experienced, that most of these decisions will be handled in a collaborative way. And here's more resources. So not that past 9:15, we'll stay on for more questions. But any of you who need to go, we certainly understand these are incredibly busy and stressful times for everybody. Go for it.
Perfect. So a pretty popular question seems to be, how do parents exactly go about requesting compensatory services? So is it more the district reaches out to the parents or the other way around?
The district was a very good question. The district does need to be reaching out to every parent. But our suggestion to you, again, every parent is dealing with so much right now. So if for some kids, compensatory services is not the most urgent issue. For other kids, families feel that it is the level of lack of service and the impact on the child makes it a very essential issue. So if you think it is important that your child have these meetings sooner than later, then our advice is what we just went over, to reach out to the school district now to let them know that you believe that it's very important for your child to have a meeting sooner than later. But again, for some families we talked to, they are very focused on implementing in-person or whatever is needed or effective remote instruction going forward. And they're going to focus on compensatory later. So it really depends on what you believe as families is most important for your kids.
Great. Another question for you. If the district is offering either a hybrid or remote option, and a parent chooses a remote option, can the child still go into school for services only?
Great question. So I think the question is, if they're going to get their instruction at home, but they have speech therapy or ABA therapy, could they go into school for only those therapies? Right. I think it's a really reasonable thing to request from the school district. And I would be surprised if the school district wasn't amenable to trying to work that out if they're not fully remote. But again, even school districts that are fully remote are supposed to be figuring out a way to safely provide in-person learning for kids with significant and complex needs.
Mm-hmm. Let's see what else. So were parents supposed to keep track of missing PT, OT, and speech services? And I think another helpful question, Julia, what advice would you give to a parent trying to reproduce from memory what was missed?
That's a great question. I don't know how any parent, I'm sure there are so many super, every parent is a super parent, but with what's been going on these months, I think it would be pretty impossible to keep close track of every service that was provided or not provided. So, and again, it's not that the services that your child might be entitled to are going to be a one-for-one correspondence. So it doesn't have to be that you've kept track that carefully. If by chance you have, that'll make it easier. So I would say go from now with your best recollection. You know, look at your IEP. If you know that no speech therapy was provided until June, but you can't remember the exact date of June, do it as close as you can to remember. The school district will have their own records, but you want your own to make sure that their records recollect with yours. And then, since these meetings are not going to all be happening the first day school's opens, if you've got the time and the bandwidth, check out our app or check out some other system to keep track of it as much as you can. But again, it doesn't have to be verbatim every detail, because we know everybody's got limited time and energy. But also we encourage you to keep track of how your child is doing. You know, if you see where, if it starts remote instruction in the middle of September and your child is still unable to access it, write it down, take a quick video, pull together what you can so that it's really clear when these teams meet how your child's been struggling. I hope your child is not struggling. The goal is to provide more effective remote instruction in the fall. But if it doesn't happen, then do whatever you're capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about, quote, can engage in remote learning? I think this parent is asking more about what are the, I guess, technical parts to the definition of can engage.
And I can't remember which slide because I just took off the slides, but if your child is unable to, it's a great question. If they can't engage because it could be about the devices, right? They don't have internet connection that works, or there's tech support needed to know how to use the different Google classroom platforms. Those are all one part of access. If all of that works and the screen is up, but the child isn't able to focus, to have attention, to be able to do what the teacher or therapist is asking them to do so that they're able to make progress in the same way they would in school, those are the examples of engaging. And that's why as a parent, your perspective is so important, because you're the one who's there, who's watching. You can see if the child's responding or not. Mm-hmm. Does that seem to answer I know I'm asking you and you didn't answer the question, but does that seem to be answering the question?
I think that's an appropriate response, yes.
It's so much easier when I can talk directly to people asking the question. You see on their faces.
For sure, for sure. Well, let me give you another one. So if the district has chosen a full remote model for the fall and it doesn't align with the student's IEP placement, or the child can't access education remotely, how can you truly agree on compensatory when the delivery doesn't work? The parent kind of sees this as a catch-22.
It's a good question. And so there's, again, for that family, there's two things that you're probably going to be focused on. Is one, how moving forward in the future to get whatever, I mean, some families just know that it's not safe for them and their family, for the child, even if they have very significant disabilities, to have in-person learning. I mean, there's going to be a lot of families, some families aren't going to be offered in-person learning. Some aren't, it's not going to be safe for them to use in-person learning. So there's one is the advocacy about what kind of instruction should be provided going forward. Then this question is also, how can I address compensatory if the compensatory is only going to be remote? I think that's what they're asking. Since I know my child can't learn remote, you're stuck in this catch-22. So if your team meets at a time when only remote instruction is being offered, then your team may decide that your child needs X type and amount of services when in-person is available to make them whole, you know, for the time that's passed. And we'll have to see how things go in the fall. We hope that kids aren't going to need compensatory services for the time going forward in the fall, but there may be if kids are still not accessing services in a way that implements IEPs.
Right.
So
right.
it blurs. It definitely blurs going forward and looking back. You know, you're having to do both at the same time. If the pandemic was over, it'd be a lot easier to figure this all out.
For sure. So our next question that we have up is, do compensatory services include the role of a special educator in a co-taught class for students that could not access remote learning?
If the IEP calls for a co-taught classroom, then the special educator, that IEP would need to be implemented remotely with a special ed teacher and a gen ed teacher if you're talking about remote learning. So if the special ed teacher, if there wasn't team teaching remotely, then again, I haven't seen the IEP, you would say the IEP wasn't being implemented.
Perfect.
Again,
Yeah.
if we're not understanding the question right, please, you know, type in your question or call the helpline.
For sure, for sure. Another question that we have from a parent. So what if an IEP requires the child needs in-person learning, but the child can't attend in-person learning, whether due to the number of students in the school or personal or family health risk? Can the school provide in-home instruction or in-home one-on-one instruction?
The state has strongly encouraged school districts to think about how to provide in-home services in a way that's safe. Again, I don't think school districts are at that point in all instances where they've figured out how to do that, but they have strongly encouraged school districts to think about doing that, especially for high needs kids, or to see if there's any setting in a community setting where the family feels that it's safe, you know, where there's not as many people around and the school feels it's safe, that they could provide in-person services. So this is really, it's like everything we've been talking about since middle of March. If the parents and the school district can collaboratively be creative about how to provide these services, the state is strongly encouraging them to do that. Because there are going to be some kids, for safety reasons, who have high needs, but they have respiratory and other issues, and they're not going to be able to be in school, and they need in-person services. And the state very much wants the districts to think creatively about how to do that. Probably have time for one more quick question. It's getting late, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone that our helpline is open. You can call 617-357-8431. So our last question for the night.
And then I think, David, did you share those resources for people in the Q&A?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so in there you've got some sample emails to send if you believe that your child should be prioritized for in-person learning. There's, copies of the form. There's other information that may be helpful for folks. And it's 9 o'clock. I don't know if we should do another question or just let people go. I'm happy to stay, but I think, whatever you think, David.
Yeah, I'll probably.
Joanne, did you want to say something?
Well, no, I was telling David, I just sent him a question that I saw that I think would be, it's an easy answer one, but it's I think a good one. Did you get it? It's in the chat, David? Okay.
Yeah, so we'll end with this one for the night. Can districts decide only to provide compensatory services to students with complex and significant needs and not to others in a moderate needs category?
Absolutely not. Every child needs to have an individualized decision, an IEP meeting to make that determination, unless the parent chooses to have a more informal process to make that decision. It's not that students with more mild and moderate disabilities may need compensatory services. Many of them will. It's more trying to triage and prioritize, since school districts can't have every IEP meeting. They can't hold all those IEP meetings simultaneously and provide services. I mean, these are all horrible choices, right? Every child, doesn't matter if you're mild or moderate or more significant disabilities, if you've lost all this chance for learning, it has a huge impact. And everybody wants to figure out a way to get services that'll help kids, no matter what type of disability they have. And it's just such unbelievably difficult times that we're even having to have these discussions about prioritizing, and everybody's waiting to get the services they need. And we know schools and parents are trying to work collaboratively together, but there's so much uncertainty. It's really hard to figure out how to live your lives in a way that's safe and productive for your kids. So thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your time. Please contact us with more questions. As of now, things always change because we don't know what's going to come down from the state, but the chat in 2 weeks will be an infectious disease doctor who will be available to help answer some specific questions that you all have. So thank you very much, and we have a good couple weeks. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
And we'll be sending out these slides and everything in the next couple days.
Right.